This weapon can literally obliterate a soldier in 182,000 different ways. Known as the M270 Multiple Rocket Launcher, or MLRS, it is perhaps the greatest rocket artillery system ever fielded. Thanks to a whole bunch of recent upgrades, the M270 can do things countries like Russia and China once thought impossible. When first looking at the M270, you might be scratching your head slightly, which is understandable. After all, is it a tank? An artillery piece? A rocket launcher? Well, it's actually a little bit of all of the above. At first glance, you might think this is some kind of Bradley fighting vehicle from Wish, and you would be partially right. The chassis on which the M270 is built is essentially a clone of the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle with some slight differences. With a length of 23 feet, a width of 9.8 feet, and a height of 8.5 feet, the M270's body is nearly an exact clone of the Bradley. But of course, there are some major differences. While the Bradley is an infantry fighting vehicle, the M270 is a multiple launch rocket system. This means that instead of traditional tube artillery, the unit will fire a salvo of either guided or unguided rockets at the enemy. The M270's business end is the two 6-shot launchers on the back of the unit. And though they may look rather simple, that was part of the design. With a normal crew of 3 soldiers between the driver, gunner, and commander, the M270 can be fired with just a single soldier once in position in a matter of seconds. But how does a 26-ton beast like the M270 get into position and fire so quickly? Believe it or not, the engagement for an M270 doesn't start at the firing line before the gunner pushes the button to unleash hell on the enemy. In fact, it starts well before that. Because warfare is largely an exercise in logistics, punctuated by short, sharp tinges of combat, the fire mission for an M270 begins well behind in the rear. With the ability to be transported by a heavy lift transport aircraft like the C-5 Galaxy, the Army can rapidly deploy a large number of M270s much faster than their 40-mile-per-hour road speed can carry them. At the same time as the M270s are en route, massive trains haul the missiles it will fire. At around 675 pounds each fully loaded launcher weighs about 2.5 tons. Because of this massive weight, trains are the most cost-efficient and fastest way to get the mountains of ordnance the M270 needs to sustain itself in the field. After arriving at the airfield, crews take charge of their vehicles and load them with the assistance of a truck known as the M985 HEMT. HEMT, short for Heavy Expanded Mobility Tactical Truck, is a critical part of the process. The HEMT differs from a standard truck due to its large crane in the vehicle's rear that an operator can use to help pick up and swing the preloaded launchers. To preclude the use of extraneous handling equipment like forklifts, the soldiers reposition the HEMT so as that the rocket pods swing off the trailer. They're now in a position to be loaded into the M270. The M270 does this by using 2 ammunition booms that come out of each launcher. If you look closely, you'll see that an operator can have each boom come out of the respective launcher. Then, several pulleys are lowered so that crew members can attach them to the rocket pods. Using hydraulics, the M270 picks up each rocket pod and loads it into the launcher. After properly stowing the launchers, the crews begin their movement towards the front. As the M270 closes in on its final firing position, the crew receives targeting data from the Fire Direction Center, which receives reports from forward observers on enemy targets. The Fire Direction Center then sends targeting data via a secure data link so the crew can plot the enemy on their own computers. Once the commander gets the M270 into its desired position, taking into consideration things like cover, concealment, distance, and escape routes, the commander then lets the computer calculate the angle the launchers need to be oriented before giving the order to fire. Now, the commander has 2 choices on how to attack the enemy: single shots or ripple fire. Single shots sound exactly like the method where the commander orders how many shots the Fire Direction Center requests and fires them one at a time. The other method is ripple. You've probably seen ripple fire on the news or in movies, where a rocket launcher fires its ordnance rapidly. The M270 can unleash its entire payload in about 40 to 60 seconds before displacing. and this is one of the most important parts of the whole process. Because the M270 is a high-value target, the crew needs to shoot and scoot as soon as it lets loose with its payload. This is because everyone and their mothers are going to start firing back at them with everything but the kitchen sink. However, thanks to the huge array of ammunition the M270 can hold, no enemies may be left to fire back. Here's why. When the M270 first came out in the 1980s, the very first munition it could fire were unguided M26 rockets. Because they were unguided, the M270 was basically a point-and-shoot weapon. However, because of the lack of GPS guidance, the original engineers created the M26 rockets with a feature that has become the system's calling card: area destruction. While the M26 rockets may not have been able to hit within a few feet of the target like modern guided munitions, they never had to, thanks to the roughly 600 bomblets that surrounded the warhead. Once the main rocket detonated, these bomblets could disperse over an area of roughly 25,000 square meters or 6 acres. With such devastating effect and prolific use during the First Gulf War, enemy troops dubbed the fallout from the M270 Steel Rain. But if completely laying waste to such a massive area wasn't scary enough, U.S. engineers continued to increase its lethality by increasing the range of its rockets. They created enhanced rocket fuel, miniaturized the electronics, and made more aerodynamic fins and nose cones. With these advances, the M26 could reach ranges up to 45 kilometers, up from 32 kilometers. However, in the early 2000s, the Bush administration began pushing out the M26 since U.S. military regulations dictated that cluster munitions with a failure rate greater than 1% had to be banned. Because of this, the U.S. military began looking to replace its M26 series rockets with something newer. Hence, the M31 series was born. The M31 series was the successor to the unguided M26 rockets mass-produced during and right after the Cold War. One of the biggest advantages of the M31 series was the incorporation of GPS guidance systems. In addition, the M31 area denial variant got rid of the bomblets and replaced them with 182,000 preformed tungsten fragments. Thanks to this, the M31 can still shred masses of infantry and light armored vehicles without any of the worry of unexploded ordnance hurting innocent civilians. These rockets are the most common munition fielded by the M270, but are by no means the only ones still in use today. Although the Army continued to work with Lockheed Martin to develop extended range versions of the M31 as well, the Army has another missile the M270 can fire well past the 70-kilometer max range of the M31. Introduced in 1991, the Army has a missile called the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, pronounced ATACMS. This missile is arguably the best surface-to-surface missile in the Army and will basically delete everything within a 300-kilometer radius of the launcher. Thanks to its precision guidance systems, better motor, increased fuel, and equipped with either a unitary or submission warhead depending on the variant, the ATACMS is the weapon of choice for any high-value target on the battlefield. And although the M270 can carry just 2 of these missiles into battle, their use in both Iraq and Ukraine has demonstrated that the missile is an incredibly potent, long-range fire weapon. However, the missiles the M270 carries have not been the only thing the military has advanced. In fact, the Army has been quite busy upgrading the M270 with some amazing features to make it relevant for years to come. After the first M270s entered service in 1983, the Army's fleet did not receive their first major upgrades until the early 2000s. This variant, known as the M270A1, received 2 major improvements: the improved fire control system and the improved launcher mechanical system. One of the first things the Army did for the improved fire control system was to remove the clunky 1980s computers and replace them with digital ones. With these new computers, they could then configure the M270 to accept software programs to shoot more advanced munitions like the M31, With the improvements in the mechanical systems on board, the time it took to load and fire the M270 decreased by an astonishing 50%. But the Army wasn't done yet. After around 20 more years of service, the Army unveiled its newest upgrade for the fleet in 2022, known as the M270A2. This version further enhanced the fire control hardware and software. With this new equipment, called the Common Fire Control System, the M270 could now fully integrate with other systems like HIMARS on the battlefield. The upgrades also allowed for the integration of new, yet-to-be-developed weapons once they came out in the future without having to create a new model. The other upgrades to the M270 essentially included rebuilding the system from the ground up. The Army ripped out the old 500 horsepower engines and installed new 600 horsepower engines along with new transmissions. Lockheed Martin also tore out all the old interiors and completely redesigned the cabins to make them more ergonomic, comfortable, and survivable for the crew while also increasing the interior volume. Because of all these upgrades, the Army basically rebuilt the entire M270, and the only thing left from the original models on the M270A2 were the chassis. But can a decades-old concept still be relevant on a modern battlefield? Although HIMARS has gotten a lot of attention in the media lately, the M270A2 is still a force to be reckoned with. Thanks to its tracks, the M270 has much better off-road capabilities than HIMARS. Of course, the vehicle is slightly slower, but the few kilometers slower the M270 goes doesn't really matter too much when you're trying to outrun an incoming missile or artillery shell traveling at Mach Jesus. However, the ability to keep up with tanks and other armor support in harsh off-road conditions is a major plus. The other thing the M270 has over HIMARS is its payload. Since HIMARS is basically a truck with a launcher on it, it can't handle the 2 launchers the M270 can carry. With the increased payload, the M270 can deliver twice the volume of fire and stay in the fight longer. Lastly, with the addition of the Army's Precision Missile Strike, which will be available within the next few years, the M270 will now have a weapon that can reach ranges of up to 500 kilometers. Because of this, despite being designed over 40 years ago, the Army believes the M270 will continue delivering steel rain on the bad guys for the next 30 years to come. Bye for now.